Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us for the second part of a mini-series on Shakespeare. Tonight we're looking at Shakespeare, commodity, money, power, all evil sort of things. Luke is with us, but he's a bit unwell, so he's in the background. I've recorded the session already, so we're going to show that, but he's going to join us afterwards. It's about an hour's introduction. Then he's going to join us and for question, comments, etc. So like you, I've been looking forward to this second part, and there's a third part coming. So here we go.
Well, hello, good evening, and welcome to part two of Marxist approach to Shakespeare. The first part was about war and revolution, and I'll get to the second part in just 1 second. But my overarching aim, as in my first presentation on Shakespeare and Marxism, was to demonstrate what I believe is Shakespeare's continued relevance to the times in which we live. And my starting point is Jan Kott's book, which is now 60 years old. It was first published in the early 60s. Shakespeare, Our Contemporary. He was Polish, living under the Soviet regime at the time. And he wrote this classic, brilliant book, which influenced performance and interpretation in the 60s, 70s, and even to the present day. So I'm still asking his question. Well, he made a statement. I'm making it into a question. Is Shakespeare still our contemporary? And we'll come back to that after I've tried to demonstrate to you that I think he is. The other thing I'm trying to demonstrate, give evidence for, is my hypothesis, if you like, about the whole of Shakespeare. I've been a lover of Shakespeare since I was at school. I grew up near Stratford, passionate about Shakespeare, and I learn things from him every day. I still read him every day. And the more I look at him, the more I believe whoever was behind these works, one or more than one person, that they all reflect, whether they're comedies, tragedies, romances, histories, they have an implicit reference, if you like, sometimes explicit, to what I call here the death throes of feudalism and the birth pangs of capitalism. I never used to see this so much, although I did begin to think along these lines when I did my MA in Shakespeare at the Establishment Shakespeare Institute, that pillar of the Shakespearean establishment. It used to be in Birmingham, it's in Stratford now. But now the more I look at Shakespeare, the more I believe he's steeped in this historical movement from feudalism to capitalism. And we often simplify his plays by classifying them into romantic comedies and histories and so on. But anyway, my more specific aims today, even more specific than the previous two, is to focus on Shakespeare's approach to money, which I think is of great interest to Marx, because his main masterpiece is called Money, Capital, and the related concepts and manifestations of money, gold and commodity. So that is my specific focus today. So without further ado, let's ask you and Shakespeare how we describe money. You think, please, I want you to participate, albeit in thought, cognitively, if not using your chat box. How do you think of money? What adjectives spring to mind from your own experience today? Then I'll show you my mini research into the frequency with which Shakespeare uses particular adjectives in connection with money, adjectives in particular. So I hope you're thinking, because I don't like to preach in a one-way kind of manner. And if you're ready, I'll show you the results of my word cloud. looking at the whole of Shakespeare's works, the most frequent adjectives are the ones which have the largest font. Like we can see immediately that money is surprise related to the rich and the poor. And that is a very convenient little dichotomy for our thesis today, poverty and wealth. And Shakespeare includes wealthy, of course, greed, opulent, prodigal. It's an interesting mixture, mostly negative, I would say. So whoever he was a pretty negative view of money. The word prodigal we'll come back to because it's surprising to see it there. Prodigality, the excess of wealth, the wasting of wealth, if you like, in kind of, if you like, reckless ways, regardless of the consequences, will be relevant to our argument. So take this with us. Let's take these words, the ones you have in mind, with us as we look more closely at money in relation to poverty and wealth and class conflict as well. To give me some inspiration, I'll go to another great William I have enormous admiration for, a later poet, a romantic poet, William Blake. Many of you will know his work, marvelous poet, well ahead of his time. And he writes a lot about poverty and wealth. And I'm going to give you a little puzzle to think about, and we'll come back at the end to the solution. There's a word missing, but he takes our words, well, he takes the word poor, which we saw in Shakespeare in relation to money. And he says in this beautiful, simple, and yet profound poem, pity would be no more if we did not make somebody poor. And your question, something else, no more could be if all were as happy as we. Deceptively simple, as I say, but we'll see how profoundly this short lyric from the Songs of Innocence and Experience by William Blake relates to our topic right at the end of the session. We move on to another little quiz question for you, keeping your minds active. I need to keep mine active, and I ask you a simple question. I'm sure you're all interested in Marx, perhaps Shakespeare. Now, which Shakespeare play, from your knowledge, does Karl Marx refer to most frequently in his writings? Given you four, it's quite a mixed bag. The very obscure, if you like, late Timon of Athens, which is incomplete and co-authored with Thomas Middleton. The Merchant of Venice, very well known and notorious, I might say, to the present day, very controversial. We'll see why. King John, another obscure play, not very often performed, but very relevant to our topic and with some surprising riches to be discovered in it. And of course, one of the great so-called romantic comedies, As You Like It. Which of these was Marx most frequently going back to again and again, including in Capital, his major work, but in many of his articles too? I don't know if you're guessing correctly. Doesn't matter. Let's just play the game, make it more fun as well. And the correct answer, surprise, surprise, is Timon of Athens. I say it's a surprise because it's not a very popular play by Shakespeare. It's the one I wrote my MA dissertation on way back in 1974 at Birmingham. And I thought it was a vaguely Marxist approach. I didn't know a thing about Marxism, really. But I was born into a left-wing family, and I thought this play, as you shall see, related a lot to my concerns about society and politics. So I did my dissertation, which Stanley Wells, my professor, leading doyen of Shakespearean scholarship, is still alive today. Didn't really like very much, but not to worry. Got me thinking. Timon of Athens, and why does Marx go back to it so often? Well, surprise, surprise. It explores money and its impact, its corrosive, corruptive impact on social relationships, which relate directly to Das Kapital. So that's why I was interested in it, and why Marx, I discovered later, was interested in it too. We'll look at it more closely. And this is our hero. I'll tell you a little bit about Timon of Athens. He's a feudal lord. It's set in Rome, but it's basically, or Athens, I should say. It's one of the Roman plays, as it were. But Timon of Athens is a rich lord, and he's very generous with his friends. And he's prodigal. He's too generous to a fault, if you like. He has a lot of hangers-on. Artists, he's a patron of the arts, poets, painters, merchants, jewelers. They all hang on. And when he goes bankrupt, as he will, he discovers the limits of wealth and friendship, what he thought was friendship. And as a lord, he has his servants. His servants warn him, but he ignores their warnings about his prodigality, his excessive wealth being squandered on these worthless friends of his. And of course, he borrows money to lend his friends money. Eventually, the creditors catch up with him. They call in their loans, their bonds, and he can't pay them back, and he goes bankrupt. And of course, this is a moment of discovery, epiphany, if you like, for Timon. He discovers the real meaning of money, friendship, power, and his position in society, and he rejects it all. And as often anti-heroes in Shakespeare do, he goes off from the court or the city, the corrupt court, to the innocent countryside, the wilderness. We saw this in King Lear. We see it in many Shakespeare plays. The escape from the court to the country. And there, as he's digging for roots to keep him alive, because he becomes a misanthrope, he's not interested in people or wealth or society. Instead of roots, he discovers gold. You would have thought he'd be pretty pleased with this, but he's not, as we shall see. But it's a discovery which relates to the other great discoveries of the time. We're talking now about Shakespeare's time, not Timon of Athens' time. In Shakespeare's time, just before the voyages of discovery from Spain, Portugal, England, to the so-called New World. And these journeys had an overall objective, of course, to bring back something in particular, wealth, of course, from the New World, but a particular commodity related to our subject. Can you guess what came back to Europe as a result of these journeys, these voyages of discovery? El Dorado, remember? Gold. And these are the natives, these are our Calibans, panning for gold in the rivers and the sea of the New World for the Spanish and the Portuguese and so on. So they plundered the New World, brought gold back to Europe, to Spain first, Portugal, and so on. And you know, it's had an enormous impact on history and the way people lived at the time, particularly the poor, which are our particular focus today. And the impact of gold, can you imagine what it did to the economy? I'm not an economist, but this huge influx of wealth coming from the New World, gold, silver, and so on, pushed the prices up of goods that people needed, whether luxury goods or survival, corn, grain, and so on, commodities generally, by over 400%, I discovered, in the 16th century. And you can imagine the impact of this inflation on the poor, who are always hanging on, especially in the feudal system, to their very survival. And as capitalism kicked in, of course, their survival became even more precarious. 400% hyperinflation. So let's go to gold. This, as I said, manifestation of money and how Shakespeare describes gold. Is he as negative as he was about money, or ambiguous? I think generally the man is ambiguous and he has a multiple point of view about many things, which makes him so fascinating. As you think about gold, nouns or adjectives associated with gold, I'll again go to my frequency counts, make use of AI, make it do something useful, and it tells us from Shakespeare's work, this is gold. We've got nouns this time. Ah, yes. What hits us in the face? Slave. Gold related to slavery. Or it's a kind of slave, perhaps. Poison. It's a poison. You would have thought it was something desirable, precious. It's a serpent, I see. If I turn my head around, I see the word serpent. Confusion. It sows confusion. Iniquity. My God, it's a pretty negative picture for such a precious commodity. What is this Shakespeare on about? He calls it a bane, a kind of poison again. Brings misery. Interesting. Well, it relates, doesn't it, to Timon of Athens, how it brought him, wealth, money and gold, as we shall see, misery. And this, we're going to look at what Timon says exactly about gold. Probably Marx's Shakespeare, his favorite speech from Shakespeare, the one I'm about to show you. And as I shut up and let you listen to it, how audio works, I want you to look at what Timon says about gold. Remember, he discovers gold when he's left the court and gone into the wilderness, and he digs for roots and he finds gold. His disillusion with society, alienated completely and utterly. And he finds what you would have thought would give him pleasure, gold. But this is what he says: positive or negative?
Timon of Athens discovers gold. Gold? Yellow, glittering, precious gold? No, gods. Thus much of this will make black white, foul fair, wrong right, base noble, old young, coward valiant. Ah, you gods, why this? What this, you gods? Why, this will lug your priests and servants from your sides, pluck stout men's pillows from below their heads. This yellow slave will knit and break religions, bless the accursed, make the whore leprosy adored, place thieves and give them title, knee, and approbation with senators on the bench. Come, damned earth, thou common whore of mankind, that put'st odds among the rout of nations, I will make thee do thy right nature.
Well, to help us focus on particular aspects of this view of gold and its impact on society and relationships, I've highlighted a few words. We can't analyze all of it. It's worth knowing very well and studying the text. But you notice the irony: it's glittering, it's precious on the surface. But in practice, it has this impact on society, which we could say in a word, if you look at these key words, is transformative, but in a negative sense. It can make one thing into its opposite. Rhetorically speaking, black into white, foul into fair. But even social status, like base, meaning lowly, the third line there, and nobility, being an aristocrat, these can change depending on the availability and impact of gold. It can help the old and the young to bring about the opposite, if you like. It's fascinating how everything can be made into its contrary, into its opposite. And religions, you see, gold will tear people away from their religions or make them change religions. It'll give them power in politics, make them adored, place thieves, he says, thieves in a powerful political position in the middle there, place thieves and give them title. Remember titles like Lord, Sir, Duke, and Earl. It'll give them power like the senators have on the bench, in the courts and in the parliaments, whatever. So all in all, it's pretty damned, this earth, this mineral gold, this damned earth, this common whore of mankind that puts odds among the rout of nations, that will even provoke war. It's profound, isn't it, coming from this playwright in the 16th century, from one of his most obscure plays, and quite overwhelming in its criticisms of the impact of gold. Very thought-provoking, I think. To focus a little bit, I'm going to look at metaphors that Shakespeare uses for gold, not only in this famous speech, but in other plays by Shakespeare, to show, as I said, that his plays, whether they're comedies or tragedies or histories, Roman plays, Greek plays, they have more implications than the conventional classification would suggest. This one we've seen, and I've said as an example that gold in these metaphors, what gold actually does is a kind of slave. We see now why he calls the gold a slave. It will do whatever the master who owns the gold wants it to do, to transform, corrupt, and destroy. I think this is what Timon is getting at. And he's seen this in the court, in which he thought he had a powerful position, but he noticed how this wealth destroyed his relationships and deluded him. And the creditors come in for a bit of a beating as well. I mean, they are described as boards between gold and what? Creditors, the usurers, remember, the usurer and moneylender for interest, high interest particularly. And here the implications are that gold is a prostitute or a pimp spreading disease. Profit, 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 profit is what it's all about. So, as I say, it's quite comprehensive in its critical approach to society. In Henry IV, part 2, just look at another metaphor. Henry IV, the father, there he is, talking to Prince Hal, successor to the throne. We're back in the court again. He warns his son, who's about to take over power, about gold, the cankered heaps of gold, he calls them. Strange achiever. The cankered means, of course, kind of cancer. So he's warning his son, about to become king, that you have to beware of the power of gold in hanging on, power and exercising it. Romeo and Juliet, romantic tragedy. But here we have Romeo telling the apothecary, as he asks him for poison, and he pays him with gold, that his gold is worse than the poison Romeo is trying to buy off the chemist, the apothecary. We won't go into the story of Romeo and Juliet now, but you notice in this surprising place in Shakespeare, we have this insight into the power of gold, and it's a kind of killer, murder, a killer, a poison. Romeo talking to the apothecary in Romeo and Juliet. I said at the beginning that Shakespeare's comedies are often underestimated or simplified in their importance by calling them romantic comedies or pastoral comedies or whatever. Well, I'm going to take an overall theme, stealing from Raymond Williams, The Country and the City. I'm going to take my theme as the city and the country, or the court and the country, and show how money, As You Like It, one of the so-called happy comedies. It's actually not so happy at all. It's much more to it than, let's all have a jolly good time enjoying romantic comedy, coming out feeling happy. Why do I say that? Well, we're going to see in As You Like It, which is very well known, but if you know it, but I'll give you the information you need to know to follow what I'm trying to say. I think it illustrates the feudal conflicts that were going on at the time in the court and the contradictions of power as we see the feudal order collapsing and the capitalism emerging. And we're going to look at the ladies of the court visiting the country, a bit like Timon left the court and went to the country, to the wilderness. We're going to see certain ladies like Rosalind, famous, wonderful character Rosalind, and her mate Celia go to the country and encounter ordinary working people, poor people, and see this encounter between the rich and the poor. Before we do that, let me give you a quick quiz. Those of you who come from a Marxist background, I'm not one of those, but I live and learn. Can you tell me which term in Marxism is used to describe the process whereby the worker is made to feel foreign to the products of his or her own labor? Which word do economists and Marx, I think, use to describe this feeling of feeling foreign to the work you do? And we'll see how relevant this is to As You Like It, of all plays. Are you thinking of a word? Are you writing it in the chat box? Here it is. Did you get it right? Alienation. Being alienated from your labor, a bit like Charlie Chaplin in modern times, just a cog in the wheel, in the whole machine. Not really owning, appropriating your own labor, or being in control of the whole process. And an example of this we've seen As You Like It is from the shepherd in the forest of Arden, Corin, where the ladies of the court are going to take refuge. But let's meet Corin first. Let's begin with the countryside before we go back to the city or the court. Now, Corin is a shepherd, and he explains to the audience and to the ladies of the court that he's a shepherd to another man. He's not his own shepherd. He works for another man, but he doesn't control his labor, the process in which he's involved. He doesn't shear the fleeces that he grazes, and he doesn't sell them. His bit is just to be a shepherd, to do his job as a serf, and shut up. Get on with it. He may have a good master, he may have a bad master. So the masters can be good and bad. We see them in the court or the city, and there are two brothers here, two lords, two aristocrats. Our romantic hero, Orlando, there he is, fighting with his brother, Oliver. Now, Orlando is brave, chivalrous, handsome. He's your classic feudal lord and knight, a kind of romantic view of the medieval order. And his brother, this greedy, corrupt lord, has denied him his inheritance, his education, and the money he actually thinks he has a right to. Because, as you see from his quotation, talking to his brother, Orlando says he's a gentleman and he deserves this wealth and a proper education like they did have. Most educated people in Shakespeare's time were the aristocrats. They could afford books and tutors, and his birth, you see, gives him a right to this. And on the contrary, his brother is treating him like an animal, almost like a commoner. You see, the common people were often compared to, well, just above the animals in the pecking order. And Orlando sees himself being treated as an ox, or no better than a horse, worse, in fact, than Oliver's horses. So we see the feudal lords squabbling over power, basically, and wealth. That's what we see. For whatever reason, they're falling out and fighting for their patch. We see another lord, Duke Frederick. He, in his case, is a greedy, nasty lord, and he's going to exile. Well, he's already exiled the father of Rosalind, who is, I think, his brother. And again, he's exiled him into the forest. He's got rid of his rival for power and wealth. And now he's exiling Rosalind, the daughter of the exiled Duke. And he accuses her, you see him there, Duke Frederick, accusing Rosalind of treason. She defends herself. I haven't inherited what you consider to be my father's treason. My father was no traitor anyway. Notice the word my liege. Good, my liege. You know, it's a feudal kind of terminology, isn't it? Don't think my poverty, her relative poverty, of course, she's not poor like Corin the shepherd, but she's been denied, like Orlando is, of her, what she thinks is her rightful inheritance as a lady of the court. And her cousin, Celia, the daughter of this nasty man, are both exiled into the forest of Arden. And there begins the pastoral idyll, the comedy that many of you will be familiar with. But I want to argue is far richer than just a romantic comedy. No, nothing against romantic comedy, like Twelfth Night, As You Like It, so on. But let's look at the ladies of the court. Now let's focus on our subject, money, and the difference in attitude towards money on the part of the shepherd, Corin, the chap we met, who's alienated from his labor, and the ladies of the court. Now Rosalind meets Corin in the forest as she and cousin Celia are disguised. You're not supposed to recognize Rosalind as a boy here, which is actually Ganymede now. Okay, there's a story there to why she's called Ganymede, but it's for our next talk, Shakespeare, Women and Gender. But she asks the shepherd when she meets him if he can offer them accommodation, food, you know, entertainment, somewhere to relax and get away from all the world's troubles in this lovely, idyllic forest of Arden. And she says, if love or gold, she's got gold, you see, suddenly she has got gold. She's not that poor. Can buy these things, accommodation, I'll pay you if you bring us somewhere to rest and shelter and feed us. He says he can't do that because he's not in control of his master's property. He's feudal lord. I don't know whether it's Duke Frederick or the other one. He's one of these feudal lords. He's churlish. He's a bit of a nasty person, a bit of a dog, churlish disposition. And he doesn't believe in these feudal values of hospitality and getting to heaven by doing good deeds to the serfs and the lower orders. And he says, besides, the fourth line there, his coat, his cottage, his flocks, and his pastures, the bounds of feed, are now on sale. It's the aristocracy in crisis selling off its land, its real estate to survive. You see, and he can't offer them this hospitality because it's all up for sale. And by reason of his absence, there is nothing that you will feed on. So how are we going to solve this problem? That we find this property, these comforts of home and so on unavailable, unless you have money, of course. He says about money, Corin, look, money for me is only important because of my survival. I only need it to survive. I know life is simple for me, that if I'm sick, I suffer. He's poor, you see. And that he that lacks or wants, doesn't have money, means doesn't have content, is without three good friends. So it's a very simple philosophy. Money for him is a mere instrument of survival. Whereas for Rosalind, It's a resource which she has in huge supply, and she offers to buy the property of this aristocrat in crisis with her gold. Will pay for the cottage, the pasture, the flock. And Celia, also disguised, offers to pay his wages. So he'll work for them instead. So they can stay in Arden, escape from the corrupt court, and waste their time. Means to pass your time pleasantly in the forest. You see. And Corin says, okay, that's great. If you can buy all this stuff, I'll try and arrange it, and I will then become your faithful servant, your faithful feeder. You see, he'll become loyal to them, loyalty being very important in the feudal order. So that's the solution of the poverty of the shepherd, the bankruptcy of the lord. These ladies of the court will buy everything up. We see this, another quick example, this relationship between masters and servants, with Orlando, who you remember was also exiled from the corrupt court. He's one of the good lords, but he's been deprived of his inheritance. And there he's got his loyal servant called Adam. Corin is a loyal servant. He's a good man. And so is Adam. And there's a nice symbolic photograph from a performer. Orlando the Lord is carrying, literally, metaphorically, the good old man, the servant, Adam, the constant service of the antique world. That's what he sees in Adam. Notice that wonderful verse there, the constant service of the antique world. How things used to be. Unlike these times. You see, in the old days, he says, service was done out of duty, not for meed, not for reward, not for profit. But these times, the fashions are different. Nobody does anything now but for promotion, profit, in other words, getting on, getting power. So that's the state of affairs that we find in As You Like It. So I'm not going to say much more for now on As You Like It, but I've shown you how it relates to our overarching theme of the feudal order, creaking at the seams, and capitalism beginning to emerge where somebody buys up the land because the aristocracy, as Lawrence Stone said, is in crisis. Now, to continue our theme of money and gold, remember there was a third concept, can you remember, which I said I'd be exploring? And to help you remember, which it is, I'll give you 10 different definitions of this very rich concept, important for Marx, important for Shakespeare, as we shall see. Still a word in modern use, and it's used frequently by Shakespeare. And these are 10 different ways of describing this key word. Again, going back to Raymond Williams and his key words. We've looked at money, we've looked at gold. Now I'm going to look at something which can be equivalent to self-interest or expediency, profit, something produced by human labor. Number 8, an article with exchange value. Well, what could this be? Whatever it is, it's got a lot of entries in the dictionary. It must be a very important word in history and in our language and way of looking at the world. Can you guess which word I've tried to define here in 10 different ways? Well, it's commodity. And you can choose your favorite, the one that relates most to our current situation, 21st century. But these are all relevant to Shakespeare and to talking about economic power and social conflict. We'll come back to the relevant definitions as we look into the word commodity a little bit more closely. So those are the 3 words. We've brought them together now: money, gold, and commodity. Let's round off our triple concepts with commodity, looking at King John, this obscure play, which has, as I said, some pleasant insights, or in powerful insights, I should say, into politics of the feudal order of Shakespeare's time, and I would argue our own time. King John, of all places, this play which is very rarely performed. But as this wonderful Marxist critic here, Christian Smith, says in his book there, Shakespeare's Influence on Karl Marx, he says King John is set in a feudal world, and it exposes power as a commodity which men are in hungry competition. Well, that sounds straight up our street, exactly what we're looking for. And we find it in King John, this relationship between wealth, power, and society's ills. So we're going to look, I'm going to pause, give my voice a rest, and give you a famous speech from King John by this anti-hero, Philip the Bastard, his name is. He's actually the son of Richard the Lionheart, but he's a bastard, he's illegitimate. So he, like Orlando, is deprived of his proper position in the feudal pecking order because he's illegitimate, and his brother, takes power. But he's got one foot in both camps. He's a man who looks back to the chivalry and the concepts of feudalism, but he's got his other foot, as many Shakespearean anti-heroes have got, in the new men, the new individualism of the capitalist world, as we shall see. So he looks both backwards to feudalism and forward to capitalism, like other characters. So let's listen to this marvelous speech about commodity from the fascinating character, a bit like Edmund in King Lear, Philip the Noble, let's call him, Bastard.
From King John, Philip the Bastard describes the power of commodity. Mad world, mad kings, mad composition, commodity. That same purpose changer, that sly devil, that broker that still breaks the pate of faith, that daily break thou, he that wins of all, of kings, of beggars, old men, young men, maids, that smooth-faced gentleman, tickling commodity, the bias of the world, this board, this broker, this all-changing word. And why rail I on this commodity? Well, whilst I am a beggar, I will rail and say there is no sin but to be rich. And being rich, my virtue then shall be to say there is no vice but beggary. Since kings break faith upon commodity, gain be my Lord, for I will worship thee.
Well, what do you make of that? Why is he telling us all of this? I asked you a question to compare this to what Timon says about gold. You will instantly see many, many similarities between the two speeches. The metaphors are very similar. The impact of gold is similar to that of commodity here in transforming social and political relationships. But why is he telling this? He's telling us this because, as he says at the bottom, kings break faith upon commodity. They change their minds like politicians do when it's in their interest, self-interest, when it's expedient. You see, the background to this 13th century setting, remember this is in the 13th century, but it's really talking about Shakespeare's own time. But we're at the time of King John in the 13th century, you know, the Magna Carta and so on. But in the background, there's this war going on. There's a never-ending war between England and France, basically between the lords and who owns France, who owns England. They seem to be in a never-ending squabble about who's going to control this very valuable piece of real estate, England and France. And at this point, the two kings of France and England have made peace. And that's what Philip the Bastard is referring to at the bottom when he says they've made a peace for reasons of commodity. They've broken faith. He thought the war was an honorable war. You see that England was right to claim France, and the king, King John, in a treacherous way, has given in and made a deal with the French, and he's broken faith because of commodity, this all-changing word, this board, this broker. You see, it's just like gold. It transforms and corrupts all social and we see political relationships. So if he finishes with, gain be my Lord, for I will worship thee. So if we come back to the definitions of commodity in the Shakespearean context, it could mean any of these things. I've excluded 7 and 8 because they're actually the ones I pinched from Marx or Marxism. But all the other ones are related and relevant to this concept even today. But this is how Philip uses the term commodity and how Shakespeare often uses the word. So it's to do with self-interest, benefit, could be economic benefit, expediency, cynicism, realpolitik, all about gain and profit, you see. And of course, these things, these commodities are of value. That's why kings break faith and they submit to this broker, this middleman, this all-changing commodity, this all-changing word. So you can make your own minds up about what Shakespeare means. But if we look a little bit more closely at the speech by Philip the Bastard, he calls commodity the bias of the world. That's an interesting word. It's a metaphor from bowling, I discover. Some of you may know this already. But it's what in bowls in the Shakespearean times, and perhaps today, I think my friends told me that a bowl, when you're bowling, has a kind of swerve to it. It's weighted on a particular side. So I suppose the metaphor is that commodity makes the world go round. It gives it direction. So self-interest, expediency is the bias of the world. It's an odd word, but that's, I think, what it means. And as he says, this commodity has taken this war, which he considered honorable. You remember, he's a chivalrous lord in one sense, but a cynic on the make, an individual who's looking after number one in the other sense. And he says, from a resolved and honorable war to a most base and vile concluded peace. So he wanted this noble war to carry on, a bit like Henry V and his idea of a just war. Remember, the word base usually refers to the lower orders of society, and vile, similarly, the lower, the common people, and honorable is a word that these aristocrats like to flatter themselves. They were motivated by honorable motives. So it's all about gain. And that's what Philip teaches us in King John. Since people at the top do this, then I'm going to do it as well. If I can, I will work for my own interests. I will worship commodity, which is like worshiping gold, like worshiping money, because it brings power and privilege. Which brings us to a setting which will bring together the three concepts we've looked at: money, gold, and commodity, from another Shakespeare play. It's actually another romantic comedy, much more to it than that, as you shall see. It's more of a tragedy than a comedy in many ways. And from the picture, you can guess perhaps which city this is and which play we're going to talk about. Use your chat box. You can just think that this must be Venice and its relevance to the rise of capitalism. And the wise Wikipedia informed me that Venice was the first state to become capitalistic. And notice the key words. The ruling class of Venice made their livelihood their wealth. They used their wealth in the form of capital, cash, ships, and commodities. And this brought them political power. They used this financial control in Venice to control the government and to increase their profits. So that's the historical background, the material background that we need to take into account. And Venice is a city that Shakespeare is particularly obsessed with for some reason. Comes back to it again and again. Before I go on to the Merchant of Venice, we'll look at Othello, the Moor of Venice. Just one speech is enough. This is Iago. This is Philip the Bastard in the play Othello, but his name now is Iago. Again, he's on the make. He's looking after number one. He's the villain of the piece, supposedly, and he's advising his mate Roderigo to do one thing. As you can see, I've highlighted the word, it's everywhere in this famous speech by Iago. Put money in thy purse. Loads of money. I don't need to go into the details. I think the highlighted words show you. You don't know this marvelous speech, this cynical speech. He says, money drives everything, from sex to power to social position, love, marriage. So fill thy purse with money. Some of you will know this speech and this marvelous play, Othello, the Moor of Venice. So let's take this with us to just confirm that Shakespeare's interest in Venice is not romantic. It's about economic realities and their impact on social relationships, the corrosive impact, as we saw right at the beginning. And it links with Timon of Athens that we've looked at, because Timon describes the creditors that were going to be an important part of Venice and our story as devils, creditors, the usurers, the moneylenders, an essential part of the new capitalism, isn't it? But they're the devils. And as another character in the same play says, the people with power, the Senate, this is in Timon of Athens now, the politicians are usuring. They're moneylenders, you see? And their motive is gaining money, profit from practicing usury, credit, and loans. Very relevant to the famous play, infamous play for many people, The Merchant of Venice. So we can bring together now money, gold, and commodity, all in one play, the fascinating Merchant of Venice, full of feudal and capitalistic contradictions. And the problem begins. The first problem, the contradiction, if you like, is that our Bassanio, aristocrat, a gentleman, there he is on the right, is bankrupt. Like Timon, like so many of our anti-heroes, he goes bankrupt. He's a feudal aristocrat. He's been prodigal, just like Timon was, and he's left all his real estate gauged or engaged or mortgaged. So he doesn't have the wealth he needs, and he owes a lot of money. And he goes to his friend Antonio the merchant for help. Why does he need the money? And he's wasted it, but now he needs money to marry the lovely Portia, who is a lady richly left. She's an aristocrat who's inherited a lot of money. So our Bassanio is actually a bit of a dowry hunter. I mean, yeah, he doesn't know Portia from Adam, but he wants to marry her. So she's a lady richly left. And there she is in Belmont. Belmont, you notice, is outside Venice. It's not part of the capitalistic order in Venice itself. It's like a little fairyland, the feudal fairyland, just outside the realities of the new capitalism. And this will be relevant to the play's development. So she belongs to the feudal world with this fairy tale, if you remember, with the three caskets, the gold, the silver, and the lead. All that glitters is not gold, and so on. And these two worlds will come together, the feudal and the capitalistic, in a very interesting way. There's Antonio, who wants to help his dear friend, Bassanio, but his money is tied up. At the moment, his wealth is out at sea. And so he doesn't really have the cash ready, nor the commodity to raise the money that Bassanio wants to borrow. So he's a worthy suitor to the beautiful Maggie Smith, or should I say Portia. Try what my credit can do in Venice. So what they're going to do is use Antonio's good name as a merchant, his credit, to raise the money. So as you know already, Antonio, who is the merchant of Venice, not Shylock, will go to Shylock, the Jew, the usurer, the moneylender, who lends money for credit, and they will ask him for a loan. He agrees. And you all know the fairy tale aspect of this, where he agrees to lend them the money, and if they don't pay it back, the deal is, the bond is, I won't want the money back, don't worry, just give me a pound of your flesh if you can't pay me the money. Okay? So the law of Venice takes the case to court, and there's Shylock, ready to take his pound of flesh. Of course, the Christians all around him in Venice, the senators, the judges, they appeal to him to show mercy. But no, he says, this is the fool that lent out money gratis. You see, that gave people money for nothing. So he's going to be punished, and there's no mercy for him at all. He actually defends himself, because I ask, is Shylock's pound of flesh actually legal or illegal according to the laws of Venice? He argues very convincingly that Venice itself, its commercial status, its power, it's an imperial power event, is based on the law, and the commercial law in particular. The charter of the city is based on this idea that the law is the law, literally, and must be abided by. So anybody who breaks the law, who doesn't pay their debts, the penalty and forfeit must be paid. Okay, so he wants his bond, and it's a pound of flesh, which began as a fairy tale, but turns out in a very nasty development, threatening the life of the good Christian Antonio, who lends out money for free. And notice his argument to the court and to the noble Venetians, that you lot who criticize me for lack of mercy, you own slaves. I don't tell you to give them freedom. You bought them. The law backs you up. You say the slaves are ours. This flesh of the slaves is yours. Well, the pound of flesh is mine. I bought it. So if you don't let me have it, fie upon your law. So much for your laws. It'll mean the collapse of you as an imperial power that is based on capital and the system functioning smoothly. So how are we going to get out of this quandary? The solution actually comes from the feudal world of Belmont. You remember the famous speech, "The quality of mercy is not strained," by Portia. So although the law does not oblige Shylock to show mercy, the traditional values of the aristocracy to which Portia belongs, here she's disguised as a judge, insist that we must show mercy, that mercy is above the law, and it's what characterizes the aristocracy who held power. So that's her argument, and that's how the problem is solved. I call it Belmont, the feudal world, bailing out Venice, the capitalist world, using this argument. And you can see the difference in the two worlds, where in the world of Belmont, money is abundant and prodigal. Look at those figures, thousands and thousands. I mean, this is money that Portia has, and she offers to pay the loan 3 times over. But the world of Venice is all about thrift and sticking to your bargains. So those are the two worlds coming together, with the feudal world rescuing the inhumanity of the capitalist world and its implications. So there's a summary of, if you like, the feudal world, which is crumbling, but represented, ideally, if you like, some of these traditional values that we've seen, like mercy and duty and charity, hospitality, and so on. But it was a very strict order. So it's the difference, if you like, summing up, between a feudal bond between people, human beings, and a commercial bond, which is purely financial. And ironically and tragically, this humanity, this mercy of the feudal world is not shown to the Jew Shylock, and they deprive him of his wealth, his house, and his religion. And he says, quite rightly, quite eloquently, that in doing this, in punishing him like this, they're taking his life and his livelihood. So if we just finish with a reference to our own day, and imagine the 21st century, and imagine Shylock is, in our world, the creditors, and Antonio is a debtor country that's fallen into debt. And I'll give you an example of what happened in the country I happen to live in Greece, in the early 20th century with the financial collapse. Greece went bankrupt, and the creditors, the Shylocks, the Troika, the IMF, and the European Bank, and so on, insisted that the law be applied in Greece. Greece had debts, it had to pay them. And we did in the end. And on the right, you see the consequences of the bond being kept between Europe and Greece. Homelessness, poverty, hunger, a terrible tragedy, which some of you will be familiar with because it's common to many countries across Europe today. And this is something that the finance minister at the time pointed out, that the loans were predatory, that Greece had to pay back, and they were not to the benefit of Greece, and there were different ways of paying off the loans, more humane ways, which were not an option for Greece. And so the country suffered and is still really dependent on its debts. So I'm concluding with just some thoughts for you. We've seen how Shakespeare's work is not one-sided. We could say it reflects the ideas of its time, which sometimes are oppressive, full of prejudices, if you like, and conservatism. But as another critic from a Marxist perspective, Kieran Ryan, says, that in Shakespeare we see more than a collusion with the monarchy and market capitalism. And I think I've tried to show that and tried to demonstrate that what we do see are the contradictions, the tensions, as feudalism dies and capitalism painfully is born. So think about the relevance of the plays we've been talking about to the current European and global condition in which we live, the state of the world, the ongoing neoliberal economic crisis, I call it. Sadly, it's still ongoing, and its consequences on people's lives. These are things for you to think about. I don't claim either one of these statements is correct, but they reflect, if you like, some of the thinking behind Shakespeare's plays. You can decide what you think Shakespeare, whoever he was, had in mind when he said these things in King Lear, the first and the second, shaking the superflux of the wealth to the poor, redistributing the wealth to undo excess. That's from King Lear. And the others, do you agree or disagree that he opposes naked self-interest, the self-interest of unbridled capitalism, but he does argue, does he, for a paternalistic responsibility for the poor. I compare him to Dickens and say, well, he's very good at identifying the problem, but in the end, does he offer anything more than charity and philanthropy as a solution? Some thoughts to take away. So coming back to the original question, is he still our contemporary? Clearly, you can guess that I think he is, and we still have a lot to learn and discuss. And we go back to the two quotations. I've mentioned the quality of mercy from the feudal Portia, who brings in this argument above a commercial law to ask for pity, compassion. But to finish the quotation from Blake, which is very thought-provoking, the missing word was mercy that I began with. Pity would be no more if we did not make somebody poor. And mercy no more could be if all were as happy as we, if all were as happy as Portia and Bassanio. So there you go, that's the end. And there's some books I've found useful and you may want to know more about if you want to read more about Shakespeare and Marxism. That brings me to the end. If you have any questions, I'm happy to try and answer. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very
Right.
much, Luke. Thank you very
Yeah.
much. First of all, really apologies for all the technical issues there. It was some setting in Zoom that you had to change, some new setting things. Sorry about that, comrades. The video will be faultless, and we've luckily recorded already, so we can, when we put out the videos that will be watched by hundreds more, that will be absolutely in perfect condition. So that was a really fascinating journey through all sorts of things around money, commodity, power, even, etc. So thank you very much, Luke. If comrades have any questions or anybody would like to ask or make a comment, please click raise hand and I can bring you in. To get the ball rolling, I mean, clearly Shakespeare has different views or expresses different views on different things. As you say, there's a lot of contradictions, and sometimes he seems to, you know, support or think that feudalism is better than capitalism, etc. Do you think that is a reflection that it's more than one person who wrote these things?
I think you're very interested in this subject, aren't you? Well, as I said before, Tina, in our discussions, there is in fact lots of empirical evidence, and even the Shakespeare establishment acknowledges that there was a collaborative element in the writing of many of Shakespeare's plays. And if you look at the latest Oxford OUP, a complete Shakespeare, you'll find that other playwrights are acknowledged as co-authors, people like Thomas Middleton, people like John Marston, Thomas Nash, George Peele, George Wilkins. So this is no longer a matter of debate. The question is, Tina, to what degree was there collaboration? There is collaboration. There is more than one voice there. And there are even claims that there is a female voice there, which relates to As You Like It, which we discussed today. And a new novel has just been published by a very best-selling American novelist who claims that the Dark Lady, or one of the candidates for the Dark Lady, Emilia Bassano, and she was the first female to publish poetry in her own name in English history, Emilia Bassano. And she has a lot of the characteristics, the attributes that you would expect of somebody involved in influencing the writing. Now, if she was Shakespeare's Dark Lady, as A.L. Rouse, amongst others, have proposed, she's one of the favorite candidates, let's say. And she was highly educated and a feminist. I'll hope to bring her up if I'm able to produce the third part of this series, because she plays a part in my presentation of Shakespeare as Unruly Women. So the reason they say these things is that apart from the knowledge of so many subjects that Shakespeare displays, every subject under the sun, from law to medicine to sea travel to Italy to Denmark, but above all, the women as well. As far as the women is concerned, the role of Rosalind and Cleopatra and all the other female roles are not the usual one-dimensional or two-dimensional women who have very little to say or do. He gives them a very, very active roles. And somebody's sensibility is very responsive to how women may have felt at the time. So, yes, the answer is, I think there is no question that we're not talking about a single genius. There is the hand of a genius there, somebody particularly gifted, I mean, with his experience in life, his facility with language, his amazing creativity, and the remarkable ability to see multiple points of view. It's just unbelievable. That's why you get Marxists saying, oh, no, he anticipated Marx, which Marx himself clearly believed to some extent. Others say, no, he was an arch Tory. You know, he was a monarchist. People like my old fellow student at Bristol, Adrian K. Noble, who was RSC director, he saw Shakespeare as a monarchist, bourgeois, and all the rest of it. But so there are lively disagreements about this endlessly fascinating debate. The wonderful outcome of all this is that the plays are rich, they're provocative, and I don't think any of them should be banned. We should be open to the problems that a play like The Merchant of Venice and other problem plays, I call that a problem play, along with others which are referred to as problem plays, because they are somehow full of contradictions. And that is at the heart of Marxism in a way, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. I don't know how complete the synthesis is, but we certainly have thesis and antithesis. And I think this has resulted, as I say, in a fascinating writer who never continues to provoke us, and above all, to oblige us to ask questions. I think it does him a disservice not to ask questions about who he was or who he collaborated with and why he's so mysterious. There's no evidence, you see, of very much he did connected with writing. He comes, he disappears, a few legal documents, and the man is, I call, the invisible man. It's very weird, and is the most prolific writer of his age, yes, and very popular. But where was he? Where is he? He's never there when you expect him to be. So it's all very mysterious. But the evidence is there in the writing that we have rich diversity and the contradictions, which I think fascinated Karl Marx. And that's why he could see Timon and The Merchant of Venice particularly, but many Shakespeare plays, as having something to say about the 19th century and class conflict in his own time. That would explain Marx's interest. Yeah. You see what I mean?
Period of upheaval he's writing about, isn't it? And that really in the place you chose, it really comes out, the transition from feudalism to capitalism, which was of course far from finished by when he was writing. He was writing sort of end of the various end of the 15th century, early 16th century. That was beginning the transition to capitalism, wasn't it? But he really could tell or could identify some of the contradictions and key issues. Commodity, the issue you explained, commodity is absolutely fascinating, and it's still, it troubles us still today. What is this difference to a barter economy? What's in a commodity and why it's different to just a thing? The labor value, etc. Do you get the sense that because at the time, I believe, in the sense it wasn't all that clear that it would have to turn to capitalism. There were perhaps other possibilities. Rosa Luxemburg writes about this, that there were some societies going a different way, and that there was a sort of a possibility of a different outcome, that feudalism had to go, but could it have been replaced with something or
as we-
progressive?
Yeah, it's a good question. I did mention something in the previous talk about the Peasants' Revolt and characters like John Ball and Wat Tyler, and looking ahead from there, from the 14th century to the 17th, and the diggers and the levelers, and the idea of a commonwealth, which had many meanings, but one of the meanings relates very much to modern socialism too. They actually meant all things in common, a common treasury for all, you know, Winstanley and the diggers, the levelers, the whole lot of them. They do, as you suggest, anticipate an alternative route, which wasn't taken because the Puritans and Cromwell decided to promote. So we have Puritanism and the rise of capitalism. I think that's Tawney, where it was, who wrote that book. So, yeah, so it could have gone the other way. And there is evidence even in England from way back in the Peasants' Revolt right to the Puritan Revolution and the diggers and the levelers. And they've had an enormous influence, although they were a small group in many ways. Their influence is still with us today. You know, Tony Benn would always quote in his wonderfully eloquent way that tradition of common sharing of the abundance of nature. And Shakespeare responds to that. He sees that abundance. And we saw it in King Lear in an unambiguous way, really. I mean, it's almost unbelievably Marxist in some of the speeches which he introduces into King Lear. So, and I think there is this potential there for a third way. Well, not that third way, but another third way, if you see what I mean.
Yes, thank you for that. Ian.
Hello, Ian.
Hello. I wanted to talk a little bit about The Merchant of Venice, in particular the position of Jews, because of course in Shakespeare's England there weren't any. So it's an interesting play, and from that point of view, because they'd all been murdered in 1290 or forced to emigrate or convert to Christianity. I was just curious about to what extent the term Jew in Shakespeare's time had come to be synonymous with usurer. Of course, Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice isn't the only play at that time to feature Jews. Christopher Marlowe's Jew of Malta takes up similar themes, but in a very different way, and of course preceded Merchant of Venice. But of course, the reason, well, there weren't, as I say, there were no Jews, but it was the position of Jews in medieval society as what the Belgian Trotskyist Abraham Leon calls a nation class or a nation caste, a people class that occupied a particular stratum in society and were kind of identifiable with mercantile capitalism, although probably by Shakespeare's time had been largely forced into the kind of to the east of Europe. So they'd been forced into Poland and the Russian Empire and so on, where feudalism was still intact, in a sense, could still form that role of a nation class. I was just wondering about whether you have any other kind of ideas into the position of Jews in Shakespearean society.
Well, as you said, in England, they had in effect disappeared as around about the same time. They were kicked out of Spain and went to Greece, where I live, and went to the then Constantinople. But remember, apart from the association of Jews with usury, which we find, of course, not in England, not in that setting, Shakespeare shifts to Venice, where clearly, I don't think he was making it up. It was probably historically accurate. But nevertheless, we can also see in Shakespeare's plays, and I did quote the way the word usurer was used against the Venetian Senate itself, and in Timon of Athens, which of course is not really about ancient Greece at all. It's really about Elizabethan England or Europe, let's say, where again, usurers are referred to within the context of the Senate, the powerful non-Jewish individuals who made up the ruling class. So yes, you're right, they are particularly associated, for obvious reasons, with usury, with money lending and high interest rates. But on the other hand, it was a movement, if you like, usury or the creditor, which was an integral part of the emerging capitalism and went beyond just the small group of Jewish people acting as creditors, because the system, I imagine, required more people to be engaged in making money out of money, as we were told in that one of the quotes from Timon of Athens, where he identified people in power, the Senate, with making money out of money, and yet called them explicitly usurers. So clearly Shakespeare didn't think it was only Jews who acted as usurers. And that, I suppose, reflects history. Some people doubt Shakespeare's historical knowledge. Every time people question his historical accuracy, he always turns out to be right, actually, and they were wrong, which is remarkable. So I think he was a man well-traveled. Italy clearly was an important part of his life because his plays are saturated in Italy. A good third of them, if not more, are set in Italy. And Italy was really the height of the Renaissance and the economic developments in Europe. The rest probably followed along with Spain. But Spain did kick the Jews out and they found refuge elsewhere. Yeah, thank you. It's a very interesting question, Ian. Thank you very much.
It's just as a footnote to that, there is, of course, Lombard Street, which is very near the Bank of England. So
yes, you're right.
Presumably it was associated with Italian bankers.
Well, there you go. They probably got around. Well, Emilia Bassano, who I mentioned, she belonged to a family of musicians who were brought over by Henry VIII to be his court musician. So there was obviously toing and froing between England and the other European powers, including Denmark, which we see reflected in Hamlet, particularly France and Italy. Those countries, I would say, along with Spain, are the countries he interacts with intellectually and reflecting the social currents of the time, economically and politically. Fascinating, really. Thank you. Great question. Any other questions?
Nobody got their hand up. I've got a few more questions, so I'll
Go
ask.
ahead, I'm all yours.
So, I mean, he's more concerned with upper classes, isn't it? Does he, I mean, you've mentioned the peasant earlier, etc., but is this a reflection, you believe, of who paid him, that it is sort of a court writer? Where do the lower classes come into his writing? Do they play any kind of role?
Yeah, you have a habit, Tina, of treading on very controversial ground.
Sorry.
Because why he's so immersed in court life and is so familiar with the court politics, not only of England, but France particularly, Denmark demonstrated in Hamlet, and Italy. It raises doubts for me as very serious. I know this is controversial, but about the mismatch between what we know of the man called William Shakespeare from Stratford, the actor and the businessman, the tax evader, the grain hoarder, and so many other nasty things. The only things we know about him are pretty nasty, actually, any documented evidence. And he doesn't seem to be the kind of person who would know much about what was going on in the court. His plays reflect inside information. I can give you chapter and verse of the life of the court, which any commoner, as we have seen in the first two talks, would never have access to. There was a rigid hierarchy. And you remember the commoners, Shakespeare was initially a commoner. He tried very hard to get his gentleman's coat of arms, and he got it in the end by fiddling it, basically. But they would never be given access to the running of the court in any intimate sense. So it's a mystery why this man, what I've discovered in preparing these talks for you, actually, is looking very closely at the language it seems the default position of so many of the speakers is a kind of aristocratic terminology, which looks back to the chivalrous antique world that he refers to, words that they use like base and vile to talk about the commoners. And it comes up in a metaphorical sense, not necessarily talking directly about commoners. We really don't play an important part in Shakespeare's plays, except for, I would say, Henry VI, Part 2, which we saw in the first part, a little bit in Julius Caesar, but they're more or less introduced as somehow clowns, stupid, or mistaken. Coriolanus was somewhat of an exception, and a fascinating exception to this pattern, where he actually articulated very clearly some of their just demands about hunger and grain hoarding and so on. But as I say, the plays almost exclusively, we're talking about 40 plays here, are totally preoccupied with the aristocracy. Hardly the middle class at all comes into it. Whereas if you look at Ben Jonson, a great contemporary, he writes a lot about the middle class, The Alchemist, Volpone. Shakespeare's the exception. He rabbits on all the time about feudal values. His heroines are never working class heroines, never even petty bourgeois heroines. They're always aristocratic heroines. And you think, what the hell's going on here? I mean, who is this guy? Some kind of ventriloquist? I mean, is he being told what to write? Or is he working with someone who knows? I mean, he quotes, let me give an example of what I mean. William Cecil was the most powerful man in England at the time. Okay? He was the Queen's advisor. And his son, Robert Cecil, took over, right? And Hamlet quotes the character, if you like, in the play, quotes a speech or a letter that Cecil wrote to his son. And how would the man from Stratford ever get hold of this private correspondence of the most powerful man in the kingdom, show him being stabbed behind the arras, which is what happens? The man, Polonius, is William Cecil. There is evidence in the first quarter that this is the man the author had in mind. And you know, it was, I told you before, a Stalinist regime. You'd crossed William Cecil or his son Robert, then you had your hands chopped off, your entrails torn out. Ben Jonson went to prison, as did Thomas Nash, for writing a play called The Isle of Dogs, the Isle of Dogs being England, and they were thrown into prison. Now this man, as I said, he's invisible. He does all these things and he gets away with them, you know? And they put on Richard II in 1601 when Essex tried to carry out a coup against the Queen. And they asked Shakespeare's men to put on Richard II, and the coup was a fiasco, of course. Essex was executed, and the Earl of Southampton, who was his mate, he was thrown into prison. But the author of the play, Richard II, appears nowhere. But they're called to the Privy Council to give an account of themselves, because Elizabeth said, I am Richard II. Know ye not that? And so they hauled them up in front of the Privy Council to explain why they did this, why they were working with the rebels. And the only person who's absent from all of this is the author. They had one of the actors explaining why they put on the play under pressure from the Earl of Essex. So as I say, it's a rich and complex mystery. But there are lots of inconsistencies, which, as I say, we should be asking questions, not closing our eyes. The good Marxists ask questions.
Absolutely.
Doesn't accept the official narrative. And I think it's good to question the official narrative.
And you do it so well. Thank you very much, comrade.
Well, I have had a lot of practice.
Maybe as a last one to sum up, perhaps you could, you know, how can it be that one writer, or if it's, you know, a collective of writers, you know, he obviously is used by the ruling class still today. You know, if you're a child in school, you have to study Shakespeare, and it is use, but also Karl Marx was a huge fan, you know, he was called
How
the
does it work? Yeah.
How
come?
can he straddle both sides like that, in your opinion?
Well, as I say, the multiplicity of points of view and his, if you like, sensibility, his sensitivity towards human nature in society. He's aware of the material conditions which shape our consciousness. And he reflects that in all this stuff about money and creditors and the difference between feudal and capitalist society as it begins to emerge. So he's a kind of universal genius, if you want to use that word, who reflects very accurately and convincingly his times. And as Johnson said of him, he was not of an age, but for all time. That's the power of his perception. And I think he was a feudal lord. My view is the reason for all this, he's basically Hamlet. And he's a disillusioned, alienated, feudal aristocrat who sees that the state of Denmark and England is rotten. And he's reflecting all of this. And it's harking back, as we saw today, to the good old days of the antique world, when there were these values of loyalty. And all the language you see is feudal, chivalrous nonsense, basically, to us, about honor and a just war. And at the same time, as we saw in Henry V, you get the ordinary people even questioning this ideology about just war. You remember we discussed Henry V and the slaughter, the cannon fodder that people represented, ordinary people, for these pointless wars, where it's aristocrats squabbling over what I call the real estate of France, above all, and England. So I don't know what to say, really. I think there is a profound mystery here. People say, we have the work, what else do you want? I think it's interesting if you shift the focus. What the establishment, you see, does today, they appropriate Shakespeare and they make him a monarchist, which suits them fine. They make him somebody who doesn't want to rock the boat, somebody who has only contempt for ordinary people. And there's an element of truth in this. I mean, it's not by accident that Boris Johnson is a great fan of Shakespeare, as well as left-wing writers too. It's no accident. But you see what's happened, the academic establishment reflects this conservative point of view. They don't like the tradition view to be questioned. And they just keep repeating out the same old cliches about, you know, romantic love, romantic happy comedies. What's happy about As You Like It? What's happy about The Merchant of Venice? These are not romantic comedies.
Romeo and Juliet, not that romantic either. Not that.
Well, it's tragic. I mean, that also, we could talk about Romeo. I mean, it's one of my favorite plays. I taught it many times. And it too reflects the movement from feudalism, as Capulet tries to sell off Juliet, to marry her off for reasons of property, basically. And she rebels. And she's the new individual consciousness and the sexuality of a female who decides at the age of 13 to go her own way with Romeo. I mean, it's remarkable what kind of female. And Juliet is generally assumed to be some kind of soppy romantic heroine like you'd find in these, you know, paperback romantic novels that people read on the beach. She's not that at all. She's much, much richer as a personality and more subversive. Or is it the play that's subversive? She doesn't know she's subversive, but we know she is because of the way she articulates her passion for sex on the first night. Gallop apace, she says, ye fiery-footed steeds. She's talking about looking forward to having sex. Now, where would you find that? And this is a man, supposedly, this you know, stingy, tax-evading, grain-hoarding man from Stratford, creating these wonderful female characters time and again. And yet his own daughters were illiterate, as was his whole family. They signed their names with a cross. And then people ask me, well, why are you questioning the established, view. You must be a flat earther. I'm not. I loved Shakespeare. I taught all this crap at university. Before I thought, this doesn't make sense. It doesn't hang together. And the closer you look, first for a start, the man was a lawyer. His use of legal language it's just everywhere. He unconsciously uses legal language. Now, if Shakespeare was a lawyer, we would have known it. There's no evidence that he had anything to do with the law, because these things were documented. You couldn't be a lawyer if you didn't go to the Inns of Court or whatever. Perhaps he was a lawyer's clerk, but we don't see his signature anywhere. We've just got 6 funny-looking signatures. They're all different. And that's about it. And in his will, he says nothing about being a writer. He doesn't mention any writers in his will. It's see why I say, let's ask questions. Let's keep asking. Let's enjoy Shakespeare. And I've enjoyed many conventional performances. I'm a great fan of Maggie Smith and her Desdemona, the first play I saw at the cinema with the late, great Maggie, playing the most beautiful, character, Desdemona, to Olivia's Othello, and so on. So we can enjoy Shakespeare in our own ways. I'm happy to do that. And any friend of Shakespeare's is a friend of mine, whatever their angle. So thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Luke. I very much hope you're going to be well enough to do the 3rd part, because that sounds absolutely fascinating. Unruly women.
I'm working on it. I'm nearly there. But I
Brilliant.
just have to keep my fingers crossed my health keeps up a bit,
Wonderful.
So thank you very much.
Thank you so much,
I'm
Luke.
happy to debate these issues anytime with
If
anyone.
anybody has any, contradictions or any questions, any criticism, bring them to the next session, perhaps, because there aren't any tonight. But we all enjoyed greatly. There have been very good comments in the chat and everything. So thank you very much, Conrad.
You're welcome. Thank you very much, Tina.
Next week, we're going to look at imperialism again, the 3rd session in the mini series with Ian Spencer and Matthew Jones. And I hope you can join us then. Thank you very much, Luke. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.